Hello and welcome everyone. Today's video is going to be about definitions, which is probably the single most boring aspect of debating. However, as an educator, it is important to remember that probably when it comes to definitions, you have less room for personal subjective interpretations than you may have for some other areas of debating. So it is important that we get it right. So let's get cracking. First off, squirrels. What is a squirrel? A squirrel is a definition of the motion which seeks to diminish or evade the burden of proof the motion places on the opening government. Now, a definition may be considered a squirrel if it is literally inconsistent with the words of the actual motion that was said. So, if the motion is, this house would place tolls on all roads, and opening government suggests that they would place tolls only on major motorways, this is clearly invalid, since the motion specifically says all roads. However, there are some things opening government can get away with. Opening government does have the right to exclude marginal or especially extreme cases from the debate, as long as three conditions are fulfilled. Firstly, if opening government can provide clear criteria on which cases are excluded. Secondly, if they can give a compelling justification for doing so. And thirdly, if such exclusions do not unfairly disadvantage other teams in the debate. In this situation, it would be considered intelligently defining the debate or the motion instead of squirreling. Now, once the definition has been given, what can the speakers do? First off is the leader of opposition. The leader of opposition is the only speaker who is able to challenge the definition. If they don't challenge the definition, the debate proceeds as per the original definition. Now, let's say the leader of opposition has challenged the definition. What does the DPM do? They can do two things. Firstly, the DPM accepts the challenge, in which case the debate proceeds as per the challenged definition. Or B, they can reject the challenge. They say they disagree and they don't accept the challenge, in which case the key question comes back to the adjudicator to decide, do you accept or do you not accept the challenge? So what do teams do? Teams now have a choice as to which definition they want to argue under, or possibly both. This is an exceptional case where opening opposition and the closing teams can choose either definition or both to base their arguments on. Now, for judges, there are three things to keep in mind. Firstly, as a judge, the question is binary, right? So unlike metrics or even place and time setting of the debate, where there's a little bit more nuance or there are shades of gray possibly, in this situation, it is binary. You either accept the original definition or you accept the challenge. Second, if you accept the challenge, then all arguments must be evaluated relative to the new definition that you see as having won the definitional clash. And the vice versa also applies. So if you reject the challenge, then all the material in the debate must be weighed against the original definition that you have decided to accept. The third thing to keep in mind as an adjudicator is that it is possible that arguments will have value even when considered under a different definition in the debate. In those instances, you should still credit those arguments. So for example, arguments on the motion we discussed on how tolls on major motorways can raise tax revenue for the government would still apply even if the definition is broadened to all roads after a successful challenge, because you could obviously still get tax revenue by placing tolls on all roads. Cool. Now that we are done with squirreling, let's move on to time setting and place setting. The first thing to say, I suppose, is that it is still a type of squirrel, so broadly speaking, treated the same way. However, let's talk about two leeways that opening governments can get. First of all, if the motion explicitly allows a time set or a place set, we must allow for it to happen. So if the motion specifically puts a timestamp on it, like this is 1981 and blah blah blah, then obviously the debate happens in 1981. So in that case, that time set is allowed. Or if the motion specifically sets a place, like in Hungary we must do this, then obviously the debate is about Hungary, right? So if the motion allows for it, then a time set or a place set is obviously allowed, and that's where the debate happens. Otherwise, we presume that the debate happens now in the bulk of countries around the whole world. This is important. The time is now, and the place is in the bulk of countries around the whole world, not a specific type of countries or specific forms of democracies even. Cool. The second type of leeway is in terms of timing, right? So the implementation is not necessarily immediate, but it's also not necessarily a ridiculous amount of time into the future. So, for instance, let's say the motion is this House would end all government funding for the arts. It would be acceptable to say we will still we will still honor existing commitments in terms of funding. However, we will no longer give any further grants from now onwards. That seems like a reasonable amount of time to implement. What would not be acceptable, of course, would be if you just came up and said, if a debater came up and said, in 500 years time, when automation is in place, this motion will take effect because that's the time where there is a lot of excess free time, excess capital, and a lot of appreciation for the arts. So that's when we would be implementing it. That would not be an acceptable definition in that instance. Okay. So except those two leeways that we just discussed, it is strongly not okay to place or time set. So if the motion is, this House would end all government funding of the arts, opening government cannot come up and say we would ban it only in the United States and the United Kingdom. Or similarly, they cannot come up and say we would set the debate in 1946 post-World War II. These are place sets or time sets that are strongly not okay. Now, if that's the case, what do you do as a judge? You reject the definition and apply all arguments to the non-place time set to see if they still have value. So a team might still win if their arguments about the United States apply worldwide, or if their principal case is as true in the 1940s as it is today. So, for example, if they argue that government funding of arts leads to self-censorship and a chilling effect, that might apply in the general context and the present day as well. So even though they defined it in the United States, it still applies in the general context, so you should credit that argument in that sense. The second thing to remember as a judge is that don't intervene if no one challenges the definition. Even if it is not great, that is the definition throughout the debate. Right. Now, a couple of things to keep in mind. First off, this is unlike metrics when teams don't agree, right? So with metrics, you can use your reasonable person perspective to find some combination of them to be important. It's shades of gray. With definitions, they are either valid or not. Second thing to keep in mind is the definition challenges cannot be implicit. They must be explicit in challenging it and explaining why it is invalid. Teams cannot just complain that it is not what they would have done personally. Even if you agree with their complaint, that is not sufficient to say the definition is invalid. I hope that makes it clear. Fingers crossed that what you have learned today, you will never have to implement as an adjudicator, but chances are you will. So best of luck. Now that I'm finally done with my more boring video on definitions, I can do something a little bit more interesting on Fiat and models. A hot topic in debating right now. But before I do so, I would like to acknowledge the Astana EU DC judging guide and thank that particular team for their input because they were critical in the creation of this particular video. Okay, so let's get cracking. First up, proposition Fiat. What is it? Proposition Fiat means it is assumed that the policy will be implemented in the manner that the government teams set up. An additional note on this is that proposition teams can include clauses in the model that are not literally what the motion says, as long as they're reasonable. So, for example, this House would legalize euthanasia. Proposition can say that governments will impose cooling off periods for individuals to carefully consider their choices. Now, this is okay and this is valid because even though it is not literally said in the motion, this feels reasonable. You may ask, but how do we know what is reasonable? Well, that is basically something you can expect the government to actually do in context of the real world. Even if it requires additional political will, that's fine, as long as we can see it happening and it is not a far-fetched scenario. That's the gist of proposition fiat. Now let's hop over to opposition fiat. 3 things to remember. First of all, on opposition fiat is that it is equal to that of the proposition in the sense of amount of resources used to implement the model. The opposition cannot propose an alternative implementation to the motion that would require significantly more resources, capital, time, etc. than what the proposition is doing. So, example, this House believes that the Mexican government should adopt measures that enable one cartel to monopolize the drug market. It is not valid for the opposition to come up and say, the Mexican government should wipe out all the cartels as their alternative. Why? Because that clearly requires more resources, probably more time, and definitely more political will to do than what the proposition requires. As such, it is not valid. Second thing, this is also applicable to the government, is that neither of them are allowed to switch the actor of the debate. So in the context of the Mexico motion, it means that the opposition saying that a different actor should do the motion is not a valid use of opposition fiat. So it is not valid to say that the opposition would support making the United States legalize all drugs or making the United States adopt measures to enable one cartel to monopolize the drug market. Why? Because the motion is about the Mexican government. This House believes the Mexican government should adopt measures. So you cannot change the actor. The third thing to remember is that it is a bad strategy to say in opposition that we will use your money and resources to give to some higher thing that we like, right? Oh, why don't we fund education with this money instead, or give it to COVID, or give it to like poverty alleviation, as we often see happen in many debates. Why is this not good? It's not good because it's not mutually exclusive. Why? Because it's not likely. A second reason why it's not is also because it's not likely to be the same political capital and likelihood, right? So if military budgets, for example, aren't currently going to COVID relief in the real world, why do you think money saved from let's say a pivot to Asia would suddenly go there, right? That doesn't happen. Now that we have discussed the 3 elements of opposition fiat as well as proposition fiat, that nicely moves us to counter proposals, which you can think of as a summary of the points we have made so far about fiat, right? Okay, so what is a counterprop? A counterprop is basically an alternative mechanism for addressing the problem government tries to solve by the policy in the motion. If the opposition team commits to a counterprop, this sets the new comparison with the proposition team. That's for the judge to take note of. Now, there is no requirement to have a counterprop, and that's very important. The vast majority of debates, in fact, involve opening opposition simply disagreeing that the policy proposed is a good one and probably just saying that it does more harm than good, right? Now, what is an acceptable or a valid counterproposal? So if you think about the fiat concepts we just talked about, it is basically 3 things, right? For an acceptable or a valid counterproposal to be made, firstly, it must be mutually exclusive with the policy set forth by the opening government. Secondly, it must go against the motion, right? So it has to be in line with what the opposition is supposed to defend from the motion. And thirdly, it must involve the same actor stipulated by the motion as set up by the opening government. Opposition teams have a level of fiat equivalent to that granted to government teams when proposing a counterprop. Now, if a counterprop is used, this binds closing teams as well, i.e., if closing opposition cannot choose different counterprop, i.e., closing opposition cannot choose a different counterprop, right? And must be consistent with what the opening opposition has chosen. So an opposition team proposing a counterprop is then required to defend their proposal and persuade that it is preferable to the mechanism set by the opening government, just like a government team would have done with the policy in the motion. Okay. To illustrate these various points, let's go through 3 examples. First, let's say the motion is this House would legalize prostitution. A valid counterprop to say would be we are against penalizing sex workers, but we think we should increase enforcement against sex consumers and procurers, i.e. pimps, right? Why is this valid to say? Because you are not, using more resources, and it fills all of the conditions that you're talking about, and you're still opposing the essence of the motion. Cool. Second, this House would not give benefits to families of children who aren't vaccinated. This House would not give benefits to families of children who aren't vaccinated. It would not be valid for the opposition to say we would educate parents about the benefits of vaccines. Why? Because it's not mutually exclusive. Proposition can just as easily come up and say we will educate them as well. However, opposition can say that education will suffice. So they will defend education, and also giving benefits as well, right? So that's fine. Thirdly, this House believes that the United States should invade and forcibly partition Iraq. Okay, so let's say if proposition comes up and defends partition by saying that we will partition it into Sunni and Shia territories. Opposition cannot defend partition, cannot come up and say, oh, we defend partition into Sunni, Shia, and Kurdish territories. Why? Because they're no longer opposing the motion if they do that, right? Because the motion requires that the proposition should invade and forcibly partition Iraq, and the opposition should oppose that invasion and oppose that partition in the first place. Okay. I hope that conceptually clears up any confusions regarding fiats and models. And so if you're in a situation where you're judging a debate where there's a disagreement on how that fiat or that model is affecting the debate, you can judge that in a clean manner.